everyone. Thank you so much for coming today to our fourth Porch story this year. So good to see a few new faces and some familiar faces. We welcome back Richard this year. Some of you I know saw him last year and the year before. He's always got something new and interesting to talk to us about, so we're so pleased he's here again. Before we begin, I just want to give a big shout out of thanks to EV's Reserve and Friends of EV's for sponsoring this series and making it possible. And I want to encourage you to look up Richard's books or ask him about them. They're really fascinating. So I think if you enjoy this talk today, you probably also would enjoy his writing. So with all that said, without further ado, thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, my thanks to Dalva and the museum for continuing to have me back. That's always a new experience for me. So that's working out rather well. It really is. And if you are interested in we have some bookmarks. So if you want a bookmark, a free bookmark, my wife has those, and she'd be happy to give those to you. And would let you know more about our little publishing company that we do on the side as well. The kind of challenge that we had this year was it's the 250th anniversary of the Republic. So how do we tie in the West Coast with what was going on the East Coast at that time? And that does produce a challenge for trying to do that. So let me just make one statement automatically, is that 250 years ago, this was Skagit land. And they were the only ones here, and they were living here as they had for millennia. So I will mention more about that as we go along. So how do we approach this? Well, we do have archaeological and paleontological records that will provide somewhat of a picture. And just for the record, I am not a paleontologist, I am not an archaeologist, I'm a historian. But that being said, so it is interesting though when you look at it, is at the same time that Americans on the East Coast were attempting to break the ties with Mother Britain at that time, was the same time that the native people on this coast were getting hit with the initial challenges of Europeans coming into their lands. It was coincided actually almost exactly, as a matter of fact. And so they were going to have to try to deal with that. It had been dealt with on the East Coast 100 years earlier in 1607, and a little bit earlier than that, but this is what they had. Now, why were they coming? Well, they were looking for the mystical Northwest Passage. Ever since Columbus accidentally bumped into America, actually it's Hispaniola, but anyway, he actually bumped into something. Everybody was trying to get, how do we get European goods and how would we connect with Asia so we can have that a lot cheaper. But once they found out that was impossible, and let me just say, it's a little bit unfortunate that the Northwest Passage is now open. It never has been. Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian, did do it in 1905, but that was very difficult for him to do. But now the Arctic is completely open thanks to climate change. I can see you're all thrilled about that. Okay, all right. And that has created actually different geopolitical problems that we have with the Arctic because of that. But at the time, that wasn't the case. So they hit this area, and what do they find? Well, they find, once they can't complete the Northwest Passage, they do find that the abundance of the area, when it came to two things primarily. First, furs. Furs were a big deal in Europe, and they could see how they could exploit that. The first ones to really hit this accidentally was in 1707, was a Spanish ship on its way east from Manila, and they shipwrecked along the coast of Orient, the Xavier. So that was one of the earliest ones. I just thought that date was interesting because that's 100 years exactly from when they went into Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. So it kind of gives you an idea a little bit about that. So some of the people that were part of all of this, 1774, we have Juan Jose Perez Hernandez, who shows up. So it's a year before the shot heard round the world in 1775. So the Spanish are really making a concerted effort to come in here. He does find the Nootka Sound. He doesn't go ashore on Vancouver Island. He does note islands that today we know as Haida Gwaii up north. A year later we have Bruno de Acheta, who shows up, and Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Cuadra. They landed on Washington's coastline and claimed it for Spain at that time, which is very interesting because the Quinault lived there and they didn't know that they had been claimed by Spain. So they were not happy about that these men showed up. So there was a small battle. 7 Quinault were killed, 7 Spanish were also killed at that time. So that tense relationship between what was taking place, particularly with tribal groups, was matched by what was taking place with the Panmunki and the Powhatan on the East Coast and what was taking place with the coastal tribes in particular out here. Tribal names were obviously different, European names were obviously different, but the process by which they wanted to come in and exploit these things was pretty much the same. James Cook for the British will show up in 1778. That's actually after he discovered the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii. He will come over at that time. He's trading for pelts. So they're starting to look for pelts first. John Mears, who's also British, would explore again the Nootka Sound in 1789. I think we have his picture up there too. This is Cook. And then this is George Vancouver over here. This is Mears over here. And this is Robert Gray. Gray comes twice, comes in 1788, and then again he comes in 1792. And that date is kind of cemented because of George Vancouver, the British captain, who does show up in 1792 as well. Gray, though, will name the Columbia River at that time. He finds the mouth of it, so he gives it its name. Then Spaniards led by Salvador Fidalgo, and you'll recognize that last name, established the settlement at Nia Bay in 1792 as well. So 1792 is kind of a big year for what's going on the West Coast. It will become the first European settlement in what is today Washington, the state of Washington. Real changes, as you may know, will really take place with the Hudson Bay Company. I always get heckles like that. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead anyway. The introduction of the Hudson Bay Company, John Jacob Astor will build that in 1811 as the Pacific Fur Company. Fort Vancouver is built 1825. So in 1788, Gray was seeking, as I said, pelts. Historian Richard White, and if you're not familiar with him, I think his book is in there, so you know him. I've known about Richard White for many years, particularly his work on the American West. He's one of the most eminent Western historians. I had to discover a few years ago that he did his dissertation on Island County, on Camano and Whidbey. He wrote about that, and I love that book. He's incredible, what he's done. So first, it was going to be otter pelts. That was going to be the things that initially attracted their attention. And it becomes a very lucrative trade. In fact, up here, the otter, especially the sea otter, was almost driven into extinction because of that. And then after that, of course, would be beaver. It was interesting to me because I mentioned the Skagit, and of course, Chief Snicklem, who's buried just south of here a little bit, who's an important figure on Whidbey. He was actually a middleman for the Hudson Bay Company, according to a lot of the literature, and made several excursions to Fort Nisqually at that time. Interestingly, anthropologists have shown that on Whidbey, the middens that they have discovered and explored had very few beaver remains in them. So that puts forth the supposition that the Skagit people were not actually very active in trying to trap beaver. According to White, again, the long-term effects of the Salish trapping upon the fur-bearing animals was pretty minimal, which is interesting in and of itself. But the consequences of the trade, of course, were immense. And this is because of, what? New technology, of course. Initially, the Native Americans adapted guns, metal tools, trade blankets, potato cultivation, and I'll talk about camas in just a bit, but that's very similar to what they were doing with camas. And so they immediately incorporated all this into their culture. And Anglo tools brought dramatic changes to who they were, how they looked at the environment, how they looked at their own lives. As the culture changed, their natural world changed along with it. I was going to make that, the same thing has happened to us if you stop. I always used to tell my students that it's always most difficult to understand what's going on when you're inside an American moment, right? Because there's a lot of fog in there, and things are going on, and you're bombarded by information, and particularly today. How do you ferret out what takes place? It takes nerds like myself and a lot of other people more capable to look back 50, 60 years from now and go, oh, what were they thinking? And that will happen. That will happen again. But if you look at it, air travel, communications, the internet, and finally the latest challenge to us, AI. And that is going to be a double-edged sword, as it was for Native Americans when they got new technology. So our idea is to try to merge the best of what has been with hopeful positives about what can be without really losing the true direction in our lives. And that is an ongoing conversation with AI almost every day if you turn on the television on any kind of news broadcast. How do we want it? We want a cure for cancer. But we don't want to lose our jobs to it. We don't want to lose our culture to it. We don't want to do that thing. Well, the Native Americans were going through the same things. And it's kind of what I marvel about studying history is that there are so many parallels between what was, what is today, and of course what will be. So balancing the positive and the negative is an ongoing problem. As I mentioned, I get a lot of this, the Indian occupation of the land, the use of the land, the use by Anglos is in Richard White's book, and I just thought I'd give it a plug. It's called Land Use, Environment, and Social Change, The Shaping of Island County, which he published in 1980. He went on to do some really great things on Indian tribes. I think he went to the University of Colorado. I think that's where he was mainly teaching at the time. But he's an outstanding historian. So one of the tough questions that has popped up for over many years now is how long have Native peoples been here in the continental United States? When I was still teaching, Clovis spear points, that's what these are here, okay? So they're about 4.5, 5 inches long. They're fluted so that you can put a spear, the wood like that. That became very, very popular. The Folsom Point, which is slightly smaller, was discovered a little bit earlier. The Clovis was discovered in New Mexico. These are both places in New Mexico, in 1929. So the Clovis first theory dominated academic circles for a long time, okay? Well, if you look at what Folsom did, the Folsom Point took us back 10,000 years. The Clovis Point, which was supposed to be, and again, they found Clovis points as far east as Pennsylvania in different caves and things like that. But anything I'm saying about this, I'm going to give the caveat that this is open to debate. This is open to various interpretations, okay? So, it's not like it's gospel coming down from Sinai. But a lot of things have taken place over this period of time. And I know, when I was teaching, I think 13,000 was about the limit, and I thought that was ludicrous, although I was teaching survey courses on history, and what do I know? But I said, I really think that you're going to find out that Native peoples have been here a lot longer. And we'll go into those kind of things. The Vashon Glacier, the Ice Age, that was about 25,000 years ago. It reached this area of Washington about 13,000 years ago. So when did humans first arrive in this area? Richard White says, 10 to 12,000 years ago, which in 1980 was a well-accepted answer for all of this. Now, even if you were coming up through high school or junior high, there were supposed to be 3 distinct migrations across the land bridge in Beringia. Do you all remember that? Okay. And for many years, that was accepted that when the Ice Age started retreating, then this corridor opened up and nomadic tribes were following animals into it. Then there were distinct, and I always thought that was such a pile of crap because, people are just not that way. It's not like, hey, it's open. Come on, Marge, let's go. It just wasn't happening that way. And I think that we've kind of figured out. So the earliest one they figured about 16,000, the second one was about 8,000 years ago, and then the last one was about 5,000 years ago, and that would be the Inuit or Eskimo people today that took place. Some believe that these people that came across, these Paleo-Siberians is what we're calling them, were actually then the ancestors of Clovis culture. But Clovis culture actually goes kind of extinct about 12,900, because there was a surge in the Ice Age called Younger Dryas. And because of that surge, we start to stop seeing some of the evidence of the Clovis culture. The other thing that we believe that really happened, and this is always interesting to me, is that we had megafauna on this continent for a long time. We had woolly mammoths, we had saber-toothed tigers, we had very large animals that okay. So there was a scientific belief that because of the increased technology of the Clovis Point, that they overkilled all these animals. I remember reading that what? Really? And to even kill a woolly mammoth, I showed DVDs of this. You probably would try to get him into a gap somewhere and spear down like that and kill him. And there was one great scientist that I had on a DVD that says, yeah, if they killed a woolly mammoth, they probably killed one and talked about it the rest of their lives. And I think that's probably true. It's like, do you remember that big elephant that we got? There was so much meat we couldn't handle it, So that didn't make a lot of sense. And just more recently, because of a huge sandstorm that came through New Mexico, it blew off a layer of what had been, which is now a dry lake bed, but it had been a lake bed. And what had happened is that these footprints got embedded from animals and from human beings in that. And they are now, many scientists are saying that this is white sands, that's 20,000 years old. So that takes it back a lot further. Other discoveries like Monteverde in Chile, Professor Dillahay, he suggests that people were down that far in Chile 14,500 years ago. Pedro Ferrado in Brazil, they say they have evidence of 50,000 years. You kind of average out all these different kinds of attitudes about it. And so many people are now saying, all right, so let's come about 27,000 years. I'm getting closer, by the way. Okay, what I used to tell my students, I say, I think they've been here 30 to 35,000 years, and that's not in the books. So, what is important to understand is that, and this makes so much sense to me, is that these migrations were complex, they were multifaceted, they involved multiple waves, often involving maritime explorations. They didn't just all wait for that ice age to open up and go, come on, let's go. They were looking for food, they were looking for opportunity, they were looking for shelter, all those kind of things. And they have found more evidence now that they would have come down along the coastline. Keep in mind, the ice age had reduced the size of the oceans, and they're finding even below the surface now, because the oceans have risen, pieces of shard, pieces of human activity that were taking place. And that makes a whole lot of sense. They're actually calling this now the kelp highway. They could have lived on kelp coming down, and there were intrusions there where the ice age had pulled back, or the ice glacier from the shoreline, allowing them to also come in at that way. That makes a lot more sense to a stupid historian like me, But I always say, when you talk about any scientists and historians are the same way, it's like demarcation lines and demarcation points, We want things to, so it's like, Richard White talks about Camino Island, and there's a road down there, there's a line, and the Snohomish people never came north of that, and the Kikialis never went south of that, which is just ludicrous. And nothing against Richard White, really, I think he's a god. But I think that we have to look at these things in a wider thing. Richard does say that he thinks the first people to Puget Sound were physically different than the Salish people who came into this area, he says about 1300 AD. He points again to some excavations that have taken place on the San Juan Islands, where they found some human remains, and underneath it is only glacial till. So you don't have the buildup of any plant humus over time, which would show then that that activity was very, very, very early. Writer David Williams cites artifacts in the Redmond area that they date back to 12,000 years, and they've pretty recently discovered remains of a bison on Orcas Island, which shows evidence of butchering, the chips out of the bone, that kind of thing, which they now suggest goes back 14,000 years. So that would show that people up here, even if they were ancestors of Clovis, were here at least that early. Now, according to Richard, because I deal with this in my book too about the villages and where they were, because it gets to be a little controversial about that. But he says that in 1780 there were between 1,500 and 2,000 Native Americans in 93 villages. In the south on Camino, at Camino Head, which actually the Snohomish have purchased the bottom part of that even today, and that would have been primarily from the Tulalip people that were coming over. And Whidbey at Cultus Bay, Sandy Point on this area. He cites 6 permanent village sites along the north and west of Camino. That includes Utsalati, this one here. This is a lithograph from 1862. I'll talk a little bit about how the mill started, but not them. So he does cite that as well. The 6 permanent sites, which is also agreed to by John Osmondson, who is an anthropologist, that has become controversial. Okay, is anybody aware what we're with Kama Beach? What's going over in Kama Beach? All right, so they closed Kama Beach. It had some cabins there. It was given by the Risk and the Stradley family. About 1934, became a well-known resort, and then given to the park system of Washington in about 2000, and has been going on. Well, they had a septic failure, had flooding, they have a breakdown of the bulkhead, and so they closed it because it would cost millions of dollars to do that. Well, it has caused a firestorm among people in Camino, but it is on the historic register for that, for the cabins. It's also on the historic register because they found 21 human remains there when they were setting up the park. And I document that in the book as well. It is a difficult thing, is it not? People are emotional about the cabins. And I remember when I grew up there and took my kids there and took my grandkids there. We all love them, okay? Well, Indians are just as sensitive about the fact that, those are our ancestors. You can't just dig them up. And in some cases, as I explained in the book, they were dug up, they were burned, they were, parsed out, they were thrown away, that kind of thing. So they're very sensitive about that. And I worked for 5 years at Hibolb. My PhD is actually in Native American history. So I worked as an archivist at Hibolb for 5 years. And I have a sensitivity to the fact that these other cultures need to be respected. That's my opinion. He also suggests there were something like 80 or so seasonal sites scattered around Whidbey and Camino. Anthropologist Harlan Ingersoll Smith conducted a dig at Utsalati in 1907. He found middens stretching all around that bay. Has anybody been to Utsalati? Driven through? No? Okay. Well, it's a beautiful bay, and it's on the very northern end of the island.
Of Camino?
Yeah, yeah. So it's kind of an elbow shape, in there. So he conducts this dig, and he finds a number of oval depressions, about 20 by 13 meters, suggesting house locations, longhouses, along the shoreline. And so he and Osmondson kind of agree that it was probably a long, very long village. My book opens with a Skagit girl who is a little girl there in the 1860s. And so it's a pretty good description, and she gives this wonderful description about these weird sailors coming in and stuff. So again, it's this kind of collision of cultures that is taking place. But the evidence is very obvious that long-term habitation, particularly Utsalati, has taken place by the Salish people. Isaac Eby is generally accepted as the first successful white American to come to Whidbey in 1850 after a failed attempt by Thomas Glasgow and Antonio Raberson in 48. Others followed very soon, 1853. That would be Lawrence Grinnan and Thomas Cranny, and that's where my book starts with that, as I look at, it's called All Roads Lead to Utsalati, because it became such a focal point for a lot of the spread of population into Skagit, into Snohomish County, certainly down through the south of Camino as well. And we were just talking about this. This is a lithograph, but the museum here was lucky enough to get a painting donated to them of Lawrence Grinnan. I've never seen it. It comes from the family, apparently. I didn't know that it's in the book that Lawrence's sister had come out from the east, Grace, And she had been very involved in the activities at Utsalati, particularly in the 1870s, 1880s, going into the 1880s. She married a man named Jackling. And sure enough, it's a direct descendant of those people, had this painting, and they didn't know what to do with it. So they called up the museum and like, yes. They have been nice enough to loan it to the schoolhouse on Camino. It's a 1906 schoolhouse at Camino City, which Robin and I worked there quite a bit. And we're going to have a special unveiling of that on July 11th at 1 p.m. if anybody's interested in coming over. Besides just me prattling on.
Where's Camino City?
It's on the west side of it. And I mean, you go down that west side, you're going to see Madrona and Maple Grove. And it's, I don't know how to describe it, but it's, you know.
Just right next to the Camino Chapel, just right down.
Yeah, if you're familiar with the Camino Chapel, which was built in 1950. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Look, we live on Camino. We're used to being ignored. But yeah, it's right next to the Camino Chapel, which is that area. It's up on a hill, so it's not on the shoreline. It's up on a hill. There should be signs up. But we're going to unveil that, and Michelle Rushworth is the artist. It's pretty well known in Camino, and I think around the world. And she has restored the painting, and we're going to unveil that for the first time. And she's going to talk about the process, because, and this is, I haven't talked to Michelle, but I've heard people say that in some cases at that time they used pieces of mummy in the paint. Has anybody heard of that? No? Any painters here? No? Good, I can just make it up. See, it's just like teaching. I don't know why I left. But anyway, she's going to talk about that, and so that's why the painting has kind of cracked, and she's restoring it to that. So I hope you can make it if possible. So a little bit about Grinnin and Cranny. They were both Irish Canadians born in New Brunswick, Canada. They came to Whitby, to Coveland, just up here, within a couple months of each other in 1853. I think I really was attracted. I just did a short story on the Irish community in Stanwood, because when I was the president of the Historical Society over there, I had nothing but Norwegians on my board. Go figure. Anyway, I said, well, you know, we're finding out that around where the Floyd Norgard Cultural Center is and the Historical Society, this is really an Irish Catholic neighborhood. And Robin does a lot of home research, and, you know, we got into that. And they went, no, I don't think we had any Irish or Catholics in it. Okay. And in fact, for a long time when we were looking for him, we had to go to Marysville. They wouldn't bury him in Stanwood. They had to go to the Catholic cemetery, you know, in Marysville. Anyway, it reminded me of that because so many of the Irish that we had in Stanwood in the 1880s, 1890s came from this same area. Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia. They had all come over and they had kind of formed an Irish enclave, and then they just came out across through the Dakotas and obviously Minnesota, you know, and stopped there, and then, you know, yeah. I shouldn't do that. My Norwegian friends get very angry when I do those things.
Minnesotans do it.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll bring that up to them next time, you know. And I used to start board meetings like, well, what they're going to say, and, you know, and they're like, don't do that, Richard. And, okay. Grinnin really, I think, doesn't get enough credit for starting the spar camp at Utsalati. That started in 1853. So somebody, Dennis Conroy, writes about people coming in. He and Grinnin formed a mercantile, and you have the old courthouse up here at Coveland that's near the highway. That still exists, and I know I've talked to Dalva about that. You guys can't get a hold of it for it's the oldest building, I think, on Whidbey Island. It was, you know, George Kellogg things was built in 1854, and it's in good shape. It's in private hands. But, you know, they had heard about this place across the water that had amazing kinds of, you know, trees and abundance and everything. And so it is Grinnin who goes over there, and he forms a partnership with a guy named Marshall Thompson, or James Thompson and Marshall Campbell. And they're the ones that start, and it's pretty easy, all those huge Douglases and everything were growing all the way down the shoreline. So, you know, you could just cut them right there, drop them in the water, tow them over to maybe Port Gamble or something like that where mills were early on, and you could do very well at that as doing that. In fact, some of the researchers said that their partnership produced a measure of commercial and community stability in the Coveland undertaking. So they're important figures. Cranny will become the most important figure here on Whidbey, because he becomes a postmaster here in 54. He's still postmaster in 57 at Coveland. He's auditor of the island 56 to 58, and in 1873, and there may be more than one term, but he was also a member of the territorial legislature. He laid out this city of Coupeville in 1883, Thomas Cranny did, and this is following his bankruptcy in Utslotty. He'll go bankrupt over there, which I'll mention in just a minute. And then he dies in 1907. He's married, of course, to Sarah Coop, who was the daughter of Captain Coop, So he had very strong ties, and he's buried up there at Sunnyside, like that. But as I said, I think Grinnan gets short shrift because it's really Grinnan who does so much of initiating what took place at Utslotty. But he will die in October of 1869 in Vallejo, California, and he'll be buried there. And we were talking about like genealogy and thing. Colma down in California is full of Grinnans. And I keep saying, I know he had business in Vallejo, but I kept throwing it, he's got to have family. I could never pin that genealogy down of why he's buried with all these other Grinnans down there. But he started the spar camp, and John Isett, who's a very important figure here historically on Whidbey Island, will become their foreman, and in 1855 it becomes Grinnan and Cranny. They joined together. And this is probably, I think this is about 1862, this ad, but it gives you a good idea of what they were doing at that time. In fact, it's Isett who will go with Grinnan to San Francisco in 1857 to try to buy equipment to start the first mill at Utslotty. Because, of course, as they got along, they thought, what are we doing? Why don't we just cut down the trees, mill them ourselves, and we're going to make a lot more money. Well, they came up with a ship called the USS Constitution, and it runs aground at the mouth of the Columbia River. And so Isett is actually a very good mechanic, and he's the one that kind of helped put pumps together. And at the same time, to get the ship loose, they'd throw everything overboard. So all the mill equipment, everything they had to lighten the ship went over. And that was bad for Isett too. He was taking a load, he had put his life savings in taking a load to Port Townsend where he was going to sell all this to a sutler up there. But it really was a ruination for what was taking place at Utslotty. They'll get some financial backing from Captain Isaac Parker, which was great, who will be able to build the mill, and they open it in February of 1858. Grinnan really did most of the kind of organization on this, getting contracts in California, getting contracts in Europe. And 5 years before his death, and I just found this to be I put her in the book because she was fascinating. He married a woman named Elizabeth Briggs or Elizabeth Hale. The woman lied about her name, lied about her age all the time. It was very confusing. Who inherited all the wealth that his shares in the Utslotty mill. She became quite wealthy. She sold those to a man named Colin Chisholm, who I believe had worked his way up in the mills. And she married a man in Seattle who was a developer, Martin Van Buren Stacy. Can't forget a name like that. They built these great mansions down there. It's well known. She became quite the socialite as well. Clinton Snowden, an early historian, wrote this about Grinnan: a man of commanding personality, noted for his great kindliness of nature and for liberality and consideration in all his relations. He enjoyed special confidence with Indians and strongly disapproved of the loose standards and practices of whites and their relations with Indians. In the cause of education and religion, he was deeply interested and a very generous contributor. Snowden gives him credit for the establishment of the Utslotty Mill Company. So we owe a lot more over there to Grinnan, I think, than to Thomas Cranny, although Cranny will be obviously taking over after Grinnan died. He supplied both the brains and the capital for which the industry was created. But another blow would happen. The SS Pacific in 1875. Colin Chisholm is now the business manager. He's got all the money. So he gets the money together and he gets on to the SS Pacific. He's going to go to San Francisco. He's going to pay a lot of bills. Other people have given him money to pay their bills off in San Francisco. Great. Well, at some night off Cape Flattery, they run into a British ship. I think it was the Orpheus, if I remember correctly. And both ships go down. And everybody dies. I think 2 crew members were the only survivors on that. So they go, again, bankrupt at this point because of that. So bankruptcy ensues for the Ypsilanti Mill. Bankruptcy ensues for Thomas Cranny specifically. Puget Mill Company will take it over in 1876. They talk about bringing it back and forth, that kind of thing. But by 1879, the mill is pretty much toast. Gustav Jorgensen is a historian we have over there. He said that the great metropolitan sawdust town, Ypsilanti, over on Camino Island was really the mother of the first settlement of Stanwood on the Stillaguamish. It's a big statement. The Arlington Times said Ypsilanti was the Egypt from which there was an exodus to the promised land. Should really tell that to the Chamber of Commerce, shouldn't I? And it really was. That's what I'm saying, is that it was a place for, if you failed with the Fraser Gold Rush in '58, if you came up and couldn't find, there was always, you could get money, you could get work, and you could get spread out, get a little piece of land over in Snohomish or Skagit, and so many of them come through there. It's quite interesting. So many viewed native inhabitants as backward nomadic peoples. Richard White says, he fails to reconcile this with their reverence for respective villages and homeland, and this is an interesting statement, an attachment to the graves of their ancestors. Okay? Because, I digress again, Robin will get mad at me in a minute, but anyway, I've had a person who is adamant about getting the cabins back, and her argument is that they didn't even have cemeteries. No, they didn't carve stones and put them out and then put a fence around it. They didn't do it that way, you idiot. And so, so I mean, this misunderstanding just generates a lot of these things that are taking place, and I think it's still there. They thought native food cycles, for example, were a result of the virgin nature. They just had to walk out and just pick it up, and everything was lovely, and not a result of Salish occupation. Charles Buchanan, who was agent at the Tulalip Reservation, wrote in 1913 that Indians were racially improvident. They do not create, earn, or hoard except for potlatch giveaways. They were never trained for living on the land for the purpose of cultivating it. They have not in the past been, this is my favorite, they have not in the past been accustomed to depending upon Mother Earth for subsistence. Really? Okay. He says they were so reliant on the waters of the Puget Sound that abundance made them self-sufficient and, I guess, lazy. They didn't have to make any efforts on this. Food abundance was not the same for upriver Skagit people in particular. And the lower Skagit, what they call saltwater Skagit, were obviously they had big game, they had other things. And I mentioned, bracken fern, camas, nettle were 3 of the most important ones that they utilized. And nettle and bracken in particular were thanks to controlled fire that had been set by Native Americans over time on area prairies. And they did it over here, and they did it over there as well. So many of these seedlings needed that fire to produce. And White said the fire was significant in the natural science held by the Salish. And I did a dissertation on Southern California Indians, and you see the same thing there. The Spanish would arrive, and they'd see these pristine prairies and things like, oh my God, look what God had given it. It's so wonderful, The same thing happened on the East Coast, by the way, in 1620 when the Pilgrims showed up at Patuxet, which today is Plymouth. And they came in, there were villages still there, nobody living there, it was abandoned. And they went, look what God has done for us. I didn't know he was good at construction. He came down here and he put all this together. Well, John Smith, after 1607, went up the East Coast. He's the one that named New England. And along with it, he took all those diseases with him that had wiped out much of the Narragansett, Wampanoag, and the Pequot people. But, we see, that's what I'm saying, is that there are similarities that I see from studying Native Americans. The other one that I think is amazing is the sweat lodge. They had sweat lodged the Delaware, the Lenape, back on the East Coast, to the West Coast. It's always a little variance. I've done a lot of sweat lodge with particularly Apache people and Lakota, but there's a lot of similarities to how you do it. It's really the Native American church. It's like going into the womb and then being reborn. And the first thing you do when you come out is you cleanse with water, which is also kind of a spiritual besides a physical thing, because it's hot in a sweat lodge, so you're sweating out toxins. So the synchronicity of it I really found quite amazing. The Campbells, as I said, they were often dug up and then transferred to fresh areas. They would use a digging stick, and Richard White makes this point that it approached true farming. It was agriculture. They were manipulating. I've even run to people that you cannot do anything to the environment because you got to leave it pristine. Natives manipulated the environment, not as much as white people, but they did manipulate the environment. And when they conducted these burns, it also facilitated like deer and elk and other wolves, things like that. So there is, and we've seen this with what they're doing in Yellowstone. When they brought back the wolves, it changed what the elk, and then it brought back smaller animals. There's this ecological thread that just feeds on itself exponentially. And that's what they were finding out as well about these. Because we had a lot of what he calls succession forests, not the climax forests, which were the old growth forests at that time. I found also, it's in the book, writing about how there was a lot of intermarriage over between Native women and white guys, because there's no white women. So that was happening. And the Native women knew the herbs, they knew the natural foods, and that became very, very significant to the health of their family, the progress of it. In fact, there's a cascara is one thing I wrote about in the book, which is used, yeah, okay. So let's call it digestive, but it was very popular and sold as a cash crop, especially by white people. I actually have people on Camino that they used to go out as kids and harvest it, even into the 1960s, and they take it to Marysville, and it was used as an anti-constipation, type of thing. And I don't know I think they're still using it to some degree today. So, religion. Can't help but talk about a little bit about that. The white people did not see human design in the actions of Native people. White wrote that through observation and tradition, Indians altered natural communities to sustain the cultures that had created them. Technology was limited, but used effectively. They had technology, but they didn't have, they didn't have steel, they didn't have gunpowder, they didn't have John Deere and the plow, that kind of thing. But they had technology. Because of the worlds that was created, the Salish population in 1780 would be larger than any human population on the islands before 1910. Anglos, however, saw nature in terms of human domination. The religious overlay imposed a new world view on the Skagit, as it had on native peoples going all the way back to the East Coast. Native writer Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote of the indigenous belief promoting an interchange between humans, land, and nature, a gift economy. Instead of Native people changing the land to suit their convenience, they changed themselves. The exchange having a mutual responsibility. I think that's a great term, a mutual responsibility. We're kind of coming to these ideas now because of climate change, the increasing threat to so much. The religious overlay imposed a new worldview on traditional beliefs. But Richard White points out it was only lightly held. Skagit people, when priests came to the island here in 1839, they saw evidence of earlier visits. The other Spanish, particularly the Spanish, and the British when they came in. So Skagit people could make the sign of the cross. When they were taught, they knew simple hymns that they could sing in Chinook jargon at that time. Writer John Caldbeck says that despite such overt signs of faith, many converts did not embrace Christianity exclusively. Again, something exactly we see in the Southland, in the Southwest. With Catholicism, there were these hybrids that developed. So in many cases, I joke about, they came in, they said, I won't go into all of it, but, is that, hey, Jesus, what a guy. And so, you know, the Indians were like, sure, bring him in. We don't care. This looks good to me. But then, you know, it became very draconian. That's all you can believe. You can't believe anything else like that. So we had a lot of those hybrids up here and a lot of the hybrids that were happening down there at that same time. Far from being creatures of the environment, White says people had shaped the world, made for them when the first whites came in. I talk about Susie Sampson Peter, known as Susie Bailey, the young Skagit girl, who's the first story in the book I wrote. And she talks about the stable and long-standing Kikialis village at Utsalati Bay, and she's doing it in the early 1860s. The dysfunctions she saw were the sailors who would disembark from their ships and go right to the taverns and then get drunk until the ship was loaded, and then they would come. One of the interesting things I found when writing the book is how many of these guys jump ship. I mean, we have a story on Camano of these three, and two of them ended up at Oak Harbor. There's a Frosted, and there was an Olson that were up there, and another one, the Borisons. You remember the Stan Borison, the entertainer? Well, it was his grandfather. He jumped ship in Utsalati and hid out for 10 days while they looked for him. And but there's a whole bunch of them. I mean, if you can imagine, some of these were as young as 11, 12 years old. And, you know, one young man saw his brother die on a ship and everything, and he wanted to get out. They wanted to get out. So they would jump ship and take off. Professor Alexander Harmon, who I use her quote, "Native people did not all run for higher ground when the immigrant stream swirled around them, because the flood that swept some resources away, also delivered others to their doorstep. Settlers brought them other abilities for barter and employment. 1872, there was a superintendent of Indian Affairs that noted how they were working in logging mills, mines, and farms. And in the 1860s and 70s, it was that way at Utsalati. And what I noticed, though, is that there's a visit by President Hayes in 1880. He shows up there with General Sherman. They're making their rounds. And they talk about the squalor of the native community and how bad it is, and, you know, the drunkenness and that kind of thing. So that's only been a period of maybe less than 20 years, the degradation that had taken place for those people. I think what is interesting, I don't know where I bring it up just because I think it's interesting and you guys aren't talking. So anyway, Indians made their blankets from mountain goat wool. That was a big thing for them. It's one of the rare things that we have around here. The only Indians in North America to do so, according to American anthropologist Ruth Underhill. The Old World had sheep, goats, camels. South America had llamas, vicuna. But the fine hair of the mountain goat was ideal. And it would shed in the spring and summer. They would grab the tufts of hair, many times off the bushes and stuff like that, and they would then weave it like that. Along with, and this is, I love this, the woolly dogs. How many people know the woolly dogs? I knew you did because you're shaking your head back. Okay, so the woolly dogs are really amazing. The only domesticated animal that were kept by the Salish people. They were generally small. There's a great picture of one it's a lithograph or something in Underhill's book. And they're only about like this. Some people said like a Pomeranian almost, you know. But they're white, thick coats. And they were largely kept on Gedney, now known as Head Island, to prevent interbreeding. But you did have them here on Whidbey as well in different places. Underhill says that they were the swamping of the area in 1858 by the gold rush on Fraser River kind of did away with it. I would add that by that time, trade blankets were becoming more popular and coming into the area. So I do know when I worked at Hibble, we put that one on display. They have a mountain goat and a woolly dog blanket, and the Smithsonian has one. Those are the only two that I know of.
They had one at the Macaw Reservation.
They do have it at Macaw?
They found one at Ozette.
Oh, okay, great. So that's a third one then that they know. And if you ever get a chance, they're really quite neat to look at. She adds that they were a specialty in the Puget Sound and on the Straits of Juan de Fuca, and that the northern Indians, you know, the Tlingit and others up north, did not have them. So they led the rest of America, according to Underhill, because even the famous story pole people up north did not have the woolly dog. It's actually pretty cool.
Story pole meaning?
Story pole, what other, call them totem poles? Yeah, but I like to call them story poles.
That's good.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I was lucky enough for 5 years to work on the papers of Harriet Shelton Dover, who was William Shelton's daughter. And it was instrumental, and it was a real honor to do that. And William's the one that interviewed all the elders and things, and then created his polls based upon the stories of the elders. That's why I like. And so my friends at Hibble, we kind of call them story polls more than anything else. And they've done a marvelous job of finding them in Pennsylvania and Europe and bringing them back and restoring them and putting up. So it's a great situation. Anyway, David Rigg in the 1970s interviewed Harriet, and he wrote this about what she had to say about change. Hudson Bay blankets were really something inexpensive, she said, and if Indian had like 20 or 30 of them, or whatever they could put together, then other things, baskets and food, deerskin clothing, moccasins, they would potlatch and give it all away, and that was done at Potlatch Beach. Way back, like in 1911 or 1912, notices would go out from the Indian agent around to tell the Indian police that you had to make sure no Indian was impoverishing himself through the potlatch. So the pressure was on to stop that kind of thing. And that has gone on for quite a while. Then I've talked...
Potlatch Beach?
Potlatch Beach it's on the Tulalip. I think it's down toward Mission Beach somewhere. I'd have to double check on that for sure. And then I thought I'd mention the disease, obviously, that millions were killed across the United States, primarily from smallpox. But thousands were killed in Southern California through measles. They've determined that. There's also tuberculosis. And the influenza probably hit in this area as early as 1782. In 1792, George Vancouver made notes dominating sections of his journals talking about the physical scarring of the Skagit people that he came across and the deserted villages where the bones were just laying out. And in some cases, they would have felt that it was taboo to go in there with a dead person and do anything like that. So there's these huge kind of vast graveyards. Obviously, the incursion came with the pelt trappers initially. According to Richard White, in 1840, the population of the Puget Sound had been cut in half. He points to epidemics in 1853 and 54. I write about an epidemic in 1862 where a lot of changes had taken place. John Fornsby, who's also a Skagit, upriver Skagit, he talks about on his way down to Camano Island at one point, they were, as children, called over by a doctor on the shore, and they were vaccinated, and so he did not have that problem. Catholic Father Eugene Charus at Tulalip worked to vaccinate 400 natives in 1862. Only 3 of those died. The other really terrible scourge was tuberculosis, and the longhouses, unfortunately, were creating kind of a germinating effect for what was taking place with tuberculosis. So this is interesting. Early settlers to the islands reported the Indians dying in great numbers. The prediction was not often viewed with sorrow. A writer known as the Rambler in 1854 wrote in the Pioneer and Democrat, "The sooner the Indians disappeared, the better, as it will save sympathy on the part of the whites and degradation and misery on themselves. Let's just get rid of all of them." This was not a sentiment held only in the far west. Frank L. Baum, 10 years before he wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, was a newspaper editor in South Dakota. He was there during the time of the murder of Sitting Bull and the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. He wrote, "What few are left are a pack of whining curs who lick the hand that smites them. The whites, by law of conquest, by justice of civilization, are masters of the American continent, and the best safety of the frontier settlements will be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians." Why not annihilation? Their glory has fled, their spirit broken, their manhood effaced. Better that they die than live in the miserable wretches that they are. So that sounds pretty terrible. It sounds like a lack of sensitivity. So I was struck by this because Laura Loomer, who is a MAGA influencer, said the best way to keep the U.S. safe from Muslims is to deport every Muslim in America back to the Middle East where they can live in fully Islamic societies. So except for the fact that Native Americans, the people being deported would be the Anglo intruders, that probably wouldn't work out for people. That attitude is much the same, It's the crisis that we face in a pluralistic society, a pluralistic republic, when people don't want to be pluralistic. And we're facing those kinds of problems today. George Mitchell used to hold pioneer picnics at Etzelati as early as 1908. And so George Mitchell was an attorney over there, and he had this kind of romanticized version, coming across, which became part and parcel of every textbook in elementary, junior high, and high school, pioneers braving the effects. It talks about babes were born in the wagon boxes beneath the trees. Death left a long trail of borders with graves. Mitchell painted the picture of perceived savagery which hung on the flanks of the wagon train. That savagery he portrayed as embodied by wolves and Indians. Yet he said the pioneer persisted. It was a common theme of the era, American exceptionalism, a design constructed by God, a white man's God. The other eminent Western historian who I had the pleasure of knowing was Patricia Limerick. She wrote that the West is a place of intersection and collision for many cultures from around the globe. Such was especially the case for Utsalati Bay. That's what attracted me to that. Not much has changed since the first English arrived in Jamestown in 1607. The prospect for riches, first from precious metals, then land, then resources, played out roughly 100 years later again in the Pacific Northwest. The technology of the periods would make a difference and change the pace of things, but the overall condition for the intersection would be the same. White says it shook the Salish people profoundly. The coming of the white man. The new tools, new plants, animals, new possibilities changed the way Native people saw their own homeland, the islands. But if they did, the change was not a product of the weakening of traditional ways through death, disease, loss of confidence, as it was a conversion to white man's vision of the land. White quotes a Snoqualmie chief in council at southern Whidbey Island, who said, "We will give you the forests, but leave us the game and fish, the good potato lands, and the graves of our fathers." They were left nothing of the sort. Thank you, everybody. I'll take questions, but I'm going to beg off and say I'm not a paleontologist. Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned a kind of semi-adoption of incoming religions, but they were in some kind of coexistence
Yes.
with the others.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that or give us any idea of what was happening there?
Well, the one case that I remember most directly was a shaman who, if you're praying to the Creator or whatever, the Catholics, they would just incorporate certain Catholic ritual, but they would also go out then and they would build a medicine wheel and they would, do those kinds of things that they could still commune with the gods of their fathers. And I know from my own personal friends in Southern California, their belief in kind of native mysticism still goes on. There's a witch that lives in the San Jacinto Mountains named Taquitz, and you're not supposed to say his name after dark because. And I've had friends that say, "Oh no, I saw him the other night. He was on this road, and I went the other way," like that. And it was funny because I was bringing an elder home one time from lecturing to my class, and I said, "Oh yeah, I'm Taquitz. I try not," and Ernest looked at me. "Richard, you're white," which I thought was an interesting statement because native mysticism can only apply if you have enough native blood. I don't know. Because belief is belief, faith is faith, and I build medicine wheels. I did sweat lodge. I did those kind of things because I find it's biofeedback. I find relevance. People go to pews and they sit in those different pews because they find relevance. They find solace. They find sanctuary. So everybody finds it in their own way. And what we're seeing in this country today is that people are more and more doing it as hybrids, especially younger people, Gen Z, Gen X, those kinds of people. They're picking and choosing and saying, "I like this, and I like that." I kid with my wife all the time, and no offense, I always get myself in trouble when I talk religion, so I'm not trying to. And she's already given me the cut sign over there. But I see a lot of, and I was a Catholic early on. My father was Irish Catholic, and it was a whole other thing. But the whole idea is like, well, I'm a Catholic, but I'm in favor of abortion, and I go, you can't be part of the club, but not agree with the club's rules, And to a certain extent, early on, I like what the Shaker Church, that it was prominent at Tulalip, and we do find small bells in the digs at Utsalati. That is a hybrid. It's based upon cat, but they do a lot of chanting, they do a lot of singing, and the bells are important. And I only know a little bit about that because I have friends who are Shakers. But it takes the best. It's kind of like I'm talking about with the technology. You take the best of what you can, try to utilize that. You take the best from something else and you merge them together, and it's a hybrid. And so you may talk about Takwits. You may talk to other gods. You may talk to the gods of the mountains. And Indians do believe that there is life in what white people see as inanimate objects. A rock may have a certain power to it that, I've had a Lakota medicine man friend who's found that this had power. Apaches think all crystals have power. So it's different to different tribes. I asked, his name was Stephen Red Buffalo, I asked him, what do you think about crystals? Yeah, it's just a damn rock. But it changes just like Lutherans and Baptists and Catholics and everything like that. So it's ironic that Native Americans a long time ago were doing the same thing that our younger generations are doing today. They're borrowing what they like, saying, that makes sense to me. They're rejecting what they don't. So you can have, pro-abortion Catholics, even though the Pope may come out and say something and go, yeah, that's just the part I don't believe in.
Question,
Yes.
where did Utsalati get its name?
Well,
The origin.
yeah, that's the biggest question of all, isn't it? The story that they love to tell on Camino, which is complete crap, is that there was a Scotsman who lived in the village, and his wife had a new baby, and so he was so excited about it, he ran down the street of Utsalati telling everybody, "It's a laddie, it's a laddie." And you can find that in other places too, like that. It was also known as a place of berries. Somebody wrote that Uts actually, means place. Osmondson and I think that there's other people that agree with him. Native Americans often do something about the geographic positioning of something. Like Camino itself is Kaluchin, which just means land jutting out into the bay. That's all it means. And every tribe who has a name, right, it's all the same thing in their language. Like the Lakota means the human beings. We're it. They were pretty xenophobic in a way. It's a lot of them like that. So you find that all around. So I think they believe it's kind of like the elbow positioning of it, the way that it scoops around like this, like that. That's just, and there's a word like uta'aladi that is in Lushootseed, which I think makes as much sense, makes a hell of a lot more sense than a Scotsman who's drunk running down it's a laddie, like that. But I'm sure debate will continue. I give them all. It's either in the footnotes or it's in the regular text. I'll tell you all the ones that people say. So, All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I really enjoyed being here. I always do. Great.
Good job.
Thank you.